Hi there, welcome back to ThoughtSmith U.S. History Edition. This is Mr. Smith, and today we're going to be talking about the pre-Civil War South. Now, in today's lesson, we're going to be focusing on the culture and economy that existed in pre-Civil War America, specifically with the South and how that differed to the North. Now, you may have noticed that I haven't really been posting a whole lot of videos lately, and that is intentional. I've been slowing things down a little bit in light of global circumstances and really letting you guys have time for soaking in whatever it is I'm giving you with the readings. If you've also noticed, we switched over to using vocabulary, and I'm going to give you a link to the resource we've been using in the description after the video. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about pre-Civil War South. We're going to be focusing on both culture and economics. So I hope you guys enjoy it. Let's get into it. All right, so diving into pre-Civil War South, we have to understand some of the big concepts. So we're going to take a quick step back and we're going to look at both the Industrial Revolution and kind of what that did to the North. Okay, so the North was industrialized during this time period. Now, what that means is many of the people started working in factories. They started working in manufacturing jobs, manufacturing things like textiles. Textiles would be clothing, okay? The reason why this matters is when we're looking at history through a particular lens, in this case, economy, we can start to see differences arise between the northern economy and the southern economy. So the northern economy was industrialized. Lots of people working in factories. Lots of people in cities rather than farms, and not many people really needing a lot of labor besides going to a place to work. Kind of like what we see nowadays. You have parents, you have guardians, you have brothers, sisters, they might have a job. They go to a place, that place gives them a paycheck, and that's called wage labor. Now, the South was very different. The South really relied on family-run farms and plantations, depending on the size. That is considered to be agrarian. So the South was agrarian, and they relied mainly on farming and agriculture to run their economy. They had large crops, and one of their main crops was cotton. Cotton was the primary driving force of the Southern economy and also the northern economy. The northern economy was manufacturing textiles or clothing made out of cotton, and they needed a large supply of cotton to be able to make whatever it is they're making. Okay? Understanding that dynamic is key to understanding why the South in particular becomes so reliant on cotton. But there's more to it than that. Although the South was mainly producing cotton, they didn't necessarily have a direct line of transporting that over to the North. They did have some railroads, so as we see from this graph over here, the South had a smaller population than that of the North. They had relatively the same farm acreage, so both were producing a decent amount of food. The value of the farmland was much higher in the North because there was less farms. So thinking about supply and demand, when you have less of something, usually it's valued to a little bit more. But the key thing here is looking at these third and fourth factors: railway mileage and manufacturing establishments. The South had far fewer railways and far fewer factories than that in the North, thus making their economies strikingly different. The North, in order to produce a lot of its textiles, was importing tons of cotton from Europe. Who was supplying that cotton? Well, Europe was supplying cotton, but they were getting it from the South. The reason why they were getting it from the South is because the South had a lot of different harbors. It was very easy to transport goods to England via ship for the South, and then Europe could in turn send back raw goods over to the North. Now, that isn't the entirety of the story. Another thing that fueled the differences between the North and the South is shifts in technology. So we talked about technology a couple weeks ago and how technology kind of changes the way that we live. Well, a particular technology came about in the form of both the railways and the southern economy, the cotton gin. So the railways allowed, or sorry, there's actually two. The railways and canals in the north allowed the north to move products that were manufactured very easily. The South didn't have a lot of factories, so they didn't really need a bunch of railroads or a bunch of canals. What they had instead was something called the cotton gin, which allowed productivity in cotton fields to increase drastically, which made cotton much easier to farm at a mass scale, which means you could have a lot more cotton growing and harvested based on just one technological invention. And what we're going to do now is we're going to look at a simple supply and demand graph, and we're going to look at a supply curve. Now, you may have never seen one of these, but we're going to look at factors that increase and decrease supply, because the supply for cotton goes up drastically when the cotton gin is invented. So on the left, we see factors that increase supply. One of those is improved technology. So the technology within the southern culture, we had the cotton gin, and that increases productivity in cotton fields to where cotton can be harvested at a much higher rate because the cotton plant is very rough on people's hands. So when largely slaves are out there picking cotton, it would tear up their hands. But the cotton gin kind of allowed slaves to not tear up their hands, which meant that they could harvest more cotton in a day. So this improvement in technology drastically increased the supply. Now, looking at this figure, and I know it's kind of blurry, we start to see cotton exports increase drastically as the 1600s go on. So each of these numbers, and I know it's really, really blurry, but over here on the far right is 1860. In 1860, we see cotton exports spike. Cotton is the main driving economic item or economic good for the South. This means that cotton plays a central role in the economy and a central role in the culture within the South. Now we're going to move on to looking at the culture and how they were different. The differences between the North and the South became more pronounced with both the passages of time and the outlawing of certain practices and laws that have been in place in both the United States and abroad. So, in 1803, the United States decides to outlaw slavery. This was in part by a big push from the Northern abolitionists, and in Europe, you saw kind of the same thing. Slavery and the slave trade had kind of fallen out of fad. It was not in to do it anymore, and people were really pushing back against it. So Europe also outlawed slavery in 1807. Now what this does is it kind of locks down the slave trade to where there can be no new slaves coming out of Africa, out of Latin American countries, out of the Caribbean islands. We don't have slavery from there anymore because Europe isn't exporting them into America. Now, the South was the largest recipient of these slaves, so they were importing lots of slaves. When they can no longer do that, they have to kind of start growing their own economy, and it reinforces the slave trade within just the Southern economy because you kind of have to grow your own at this point. And I know it sounds a little insensitive the way we say that, but when you're thinking about the South and Southern economy, slaves were vital to harvesting cotton. Cotton is what really runs the Industrial Revolution in the North, so everyone has a vested interest in having access to this good to produce textiles and clothing. But the South, in order to run this, has slaves because they don't want to pay for wages. They find wage labor to be kind of worse than slavery itself. We'll get to that next week a little bit. But back to the South. The South becomes a very peculiar society because it is one of the only major societies that has a really robust slave culture. Now, this culture was largely influenced by the structure of the South. So the South was structured as an aristocracy. So the aristocracy basically meant that there was kind of nobility, and they were called the planter class. So 3/4 of all family in the South did not own slaves. A majority of the Southerners that did own slaves only owned a few, maybe like 2 or 3. However, there were about 40,000 families that owned a lot of slaves, like 20 plus slaves. Those would be considered the planter class because they had plantations. That's why they had so many slaves. So this planter class ran society. They were the ones who controlled the laws. They were the government in the South. They basically controlled the economy. And when you have control over an economy, you tend to want to reinforce what allows you to have that, and that's slavery. Having slaves kept your status as a planter class, which means that you can continue to run society. So really, it built a culture around slavery, and that's why it becomes very peculiar, because the North is very much against slavery. They don't want slavery. They don't depend on it for anything. They're very into manufacturing. They have wage labor. They require cotton, but they're getting their cotton from Europe, which is also outlawed slavery. And where's Europe getting their cotton from? They're getting it from the South. How is the South producing this cotton? On slave labor. So, the North does not agree with slavery. The South is dependent on slavery. And now we can start to see why cultures collide here. Because we have one group that needs slavery in order to run its economy, and we have another group that is indirectly needing slavery, but may not necessarily see it as a moral thing. As the West opens up, as we've looked at the westward expansion over the past couple of weeks, that land is wanted by both the North and the South to continue manufacturing and also to continue building plantations. So the fight over these western states is what eventually becomes known as the Civil War, because we are fighting, or I guess they were, we aren't, we know the outcome of this. They were fighting largely for a way of life, and that way of life was directly tied to whether or not slavery could exist in the United States. And we made it! Alright, so that is it for today's lesson. Sorry it's not as polished as I wanted it to be. I'm really tired. I'm just gonna say it. This has been a long month and a half, and we're still going along. So thank you guys for tuning in. I'm gonna walk you through the assignment really quick, just so everyone can be kind of on the same page with what we're doing with vocabulary. So vocabulary is an amazing tool. The people that create it are fantastic human beings. They're super creative, and I figured I might as well not reinvent the wheel. I like Common Lit a lot, but these are a little bit more engaging, and they allow us to develop our vocabulary a little bit. So within this, you'll have a few different things. You have the video section, you have vocab cards, you have a vocab game, which allows you to make a beat with answering vocab questions. You'll have vocab cards where you'll have a few different vocab, I think it's like 10 a week, and you'll need to identify those vocab and then use it in a sentence. You'll have a read and response, so you'll be given like little blurbs. You'll have to read it, and then we're going to be checking for reading comprehension with the score below. And then you'll have a quiz on the reading and the vocab at the very end. This is a really good tool for assessment. It's a really good tool for kind of deepening your own knowledge of things. And speaking of that, we're looking at Harriet Tubman, which I should have mentioned this at the beginning. Because Harriet Tubman is one of the most important abolitionists. She ran the Underground Railroad, which I'm sure you guys have heard of at this point, and was an extremely courageous woman. So we're going to be looking at Harriet Tubman and her efforts before the Civil War to remove slaves from the South to the North and hopefully let them be free. However, as we'll see next week, that freedom isn't real freedom. So, thank you for tuning in. I'm going to go ahead and head out here. I'll see you next time.